She was supposed to be invisible, a plain wife, a quiet accountant, a woman nobody at that table thought mattered enough to fear. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong. When three armed men slipped through a locked mountain cabin to put a bullet in the most dangerous mafia boss in Montreal, the last person standing between them and his corpse wasn't a bodyguard. It wasn't a lieutenant. It was a woman holding a cast iron skillet, and she didn't hesitate for even 1 second. This is the story of Ingrid Solberg, the woman they laughed at, the woman who saved everything. If this kind of story hits different for you, the kind that keeps you up at night, subscribe right now and follow every chapter until the end. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now, settle in. Part 1 starts right now. The morning Lachlan Voss agreed to get married for the second time, he did it the same way he signed off on a debt collection, quickly, without sentiment, with his eyes already moving to the next problem on the table. He sat behind a desk the size of a dining room in an office that smelled like leather and cigarette smoke baked into the walls over 2 decades. His lawyer, a thin man named Aldrich who'd survived 3 different bosses, slid a folder across the surface without making eye contact. "She's 31, Aldrich said. Forensic accountant. Works for a firm the government contracts for fraud investigation. No criminal record, no political affiliations, no connections to any rival family." Lachlan didn't open the folder. Family background? Swedish father, French-Canadian mother. Father died when she was 19. Mother remarried. No siblings. No debt. No vices anyone found. Aldrich cleared his throat. "She's not what you'd expect." Meaning what? Aldrich said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Lachlan finally opened the folder. The photograph inside showed a woman standing beside a government building in winter clothing. A long coat, sensible boots, hair pulled back in a knot that suggested practicality rather than style. She was broad across the shoulders, tall. Her face was serious, in the way that some faces are serious because they've been laughed at enough times that warmth has become a luxury they can no longer afford. He studied the photograph for 7 seconds. Then he closed the folder. When? The Beaumont family is requesting the ceremony within 60 days. The political arrangement requires it formalized before the July vote. Fine. He pushed the folder back. Handle the details. That was the entire conversation. Ingrid Solberg found out about the arrangement from her mother's new husband, a man she'd never particularly liked, who called her on a Tuesday evening while she was eating reheated soup over a financial audit spread across her kitchen table. "Your father's old association with the Beaumont name," her stepfather said, his voice carrying the particular smugness of a man delivering news he believed would destabilize her. "Apparently, there's a favor owed, an old contract. You've been offered." She set down her spoon. "Offered," she repeated, "to Lachlan Voss." The name wasn't unknown to her. Nobody who lived in Montreal and paid any attention to the architecture of money, who owned what, who controlled which businesses, which shell companies dissolved the same week certain competitors disappeared, could be unfamiliar with Lachlan Voss. She had actually crossed paths with his syndicate's financial records twice in her professional life, both times as peripheral data during government audits. Both times, the trail had gone cold in ways that were too precise to be accidental. "And if I refuse?" she said. Her stepfather's pause told her everything. She put the phone down without saying goodbye. She sat very still for approximately 3 minutes. Then she picked up her audit documents, organized them into a neat stack, and began thinking about what forensic skills were actually transferable to a life she had not chosen. She was practical that way. The wedding was held in a private room at a hotel that cost more per night than most people earned in a month. There were 42 guests. Ingrid knew none of them. She wore a cream-colored dress she'd selected herself because nobody had offered to help her, and she hadn't asked. She walked in alone. The men in the room assessed her the way men in rooms like that always did, quickly, dismissively, moving on. She watched them do it. She cataloged every face and every expression with the automatic precision of someone trained to notice what numbers are trying to hide. One man in particular caught her attention. He was standing to Lachlan's left, thick-necked, wearing a suit that was slightly too expensive for a man of his official standing. He had a lieutenant's posture, relaxed in a way that was actually aggressive. When Ingrid walked past him, he said something low to the man beside him, and they both smiled. She kept walking. Lachlan Voss at 43 was not what she'd expected, which she acknowledged was a failure of her own imagination. She'd expected brutality to be more visible. Instead, he was lean, gray at the temples, with the specific stillness of someone who had learned long ago that the most effective power doesn't need to announce itself. He watched her walk toward him the way he might watch a forecast, analytically, without readable emotion. They exchanged vows that had been written by Aldrich. Neither of them added anything personal. Afterward, at the dinner that followed, Ingrid sat beside her new husband and ate a very good piece of salmon and said almost nothing. Lachlan said almost nothing. Around them, conversations swirled about territories and business and people whose names she was already filing away. The thick-necked lieutenant's name was Bauer. She learned this by the third mention of it in different conversations. He operated the Toronto supply chain and 3 legitimate businesses in the Plateau district. He laughed too loudly at his own jokes and touched people on the shoulder without being invited to. By the end of the evening, Ingrid had learned more about the interior of Lachlan's syndicate than most people gathered in formal briefings. Nobody at that table thought to wonder what she might be observing. That was the first mistake they made. Their life together established its patterns fast. They shared a large stone house in Outremont, the kind of house that conveyed solidity and old money, even though Lachlan's money was neither old nor clean. He had an office on the second floor where he worked late into the night. She had a smaller room off the kitchen where she kept her personal caseload, her notebooks, and an electric kettle that she ran approximately 6 times a day. They ate dinner together on most evenings. The conversations were brief and specific. The East Wing guest room. I'm using it for file storage. Fine. I need access to the household account records. All of them, not just current year. A pause. Why? Because if I'm going to live here, I'm going to understand this house. Another pause. Then, I'll have Aldrich send them. She got the records within 48 hours. She read all of them in 6 days. What she found in those records wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. 3 delivery contracts with slightly irregular billing cycles. A property management company whose maintenance logs didn't quite match the invoices. A catering supplier that billed for events that, cross-checked against social records, had been canceled. Small things. The kind of small things that only meant something when you laid them end to end and asked who benefited. She didn't say anything yet. She needed more. Lachlan noticed her light on at 2 in the morning for the 4th consecutive night. He came downstairs for water, and through the gap in the door he saw her at the table, reading glasses on, pencil moving across a legal pad, surrounded by stacked folders with handwritten tabs. He stood there for a moment that he wouldn't have admitted to anyone. He'd been married before. Elena had been warm and beautiful and had loved him in the reckless way that people love things they know might destroy them. The violence of his world had taken her in the 3rd year of their marriage, in a way that he had never fully processed and had simply buried under work and forward motion. He had told himself after Elena that he would never again allow someone close enough to become a vulnerability. Ingrid didn't feel like a vulnerability. She felt like something he hadn't encountered before. He went back upstairs without the water. The anonymous reports began appearing on his desk 3 weeks later. The first was 7 pages, dense with data, cross-referencing billing records from 4 different businesses against publicly available licensing filings and property tax records. It identified a pattern of cash extraction through over-invoiced service contracts totaling, conservatively, $340,000 across 18 months. There was no name on the report, no signature, no covering note. He called Aldrich. Who brought this to my desk? Aldrich didn't know. He called his head of security, a man named Prout, who had worked for him for 11 years. Prout checked the building logs and cameras and came back with nothing. Whoever had left the report had done it during a window when the office was unmonitored, which was itself a piece of information, because that window required knowing the security rotation. He read the report twice. Then he had 2 of his people quietly verify the data independently. Every single figure checked out. He looked again at the handwriting in the margins, small, precise, and left-handed. He walked downstairs that evening. Ingrid was at her table. Without preamble, he set the report down in front of her and waited. She looked at it, looked up at him, said nothing. "Was this you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "The data speaks for itself," she said. "The question you should be asking isn't who wrote it. It's what you're going to do about it." The silence between them lasted long enough to become something. "You could have come to me directly," he said. "I didn't know yet whether you were involved." The bluntness of it stopped him. He stood there in his own kitchen, in his own house, assessed by a woman who had apparently spent the last several weeks quietly auditing his empire from the room next to where he kept his bread and his kettle. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "Tell me what else you found." It was the first real conversation they'd had. That conversation lasted until 3:40 in the morning. She walked him through the pattern of irregularities she'd identified. Not with drama, but with the flat precision of someone presenting evidence that didn't require embellishment. Shell company within a shell company. A lieutenant whose personal property acquisitions in the last 2 years were wildly inconsistent with his declared compensation. Ghost invoices moving money laterally before it vanished. She had been building this picture from financial records, from papers Aldrich had sent without knowing why he was sending them, from publicly accessible business registries, from her own professional instincts. She had not done it to impress him. She had done it because she lived here now, and she understood, with the clarity of someone trained to see exactly how money moved and where it accumulated, that if the foundation of this house was rotting, she would be inside it when it came down. Lachlan sat across from her with his elbows on the table, which, she would later note, was the first time she'd seen him in a genuinely unself-conscious posture, and read everything she'd assembled. "Bauer," he finally said. "I can't confirm that yet, not without more data. But your instinct." She looked at him steadily. "I don't operate on instinct. I follow the money." "Where does the money lead?" She laid a single sheet of paper on the table between them. A network diagram, hand-drawn, connecting 7 business entities through a sequence of transactions that ultimately routed through a numbered account she hadn't yet fully traced. "There," she said. Her pencil touched the center of the diagram. "That's where it leads." Lachlan looked at the diagram for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Nobody else in this organization found this," he said. "Nobody else in this organization was looking." A pause. "They were too busy laughing at your wife." Something crossed his face. It wasn't quite regret. It was the expression of a man who has just recalculated a situation and found his previous estimate significantly wrong. He didn't apologize. She didn't expect him to. "I need the full trace," he said. "However long it takes." "I know." She pulled the diagram back. "I'll need access to the Toronto accounts." "You'll have them by morning." He stood up to leave. At the door, he stopped. "Ingrid." She looked up. "Don't send things anonymously anymore." She considered this. "All right." He left. She turned back to her work. Outside, Montreal was cold and dark and quiet, and somewhere in the syndicate's financial architecture, a man named Bauer was sleeping soundly, entirely unaware that the woman he had mocked at her own wedding was systematically dismantling everything he'd built. The invitation to the mountain retreat arrived 2 weeks later. Lachlan mentioned it at dinner, casually, in the way that was not actually casual. "There's a strategy gathering at Belmore Estate in the Laurentians. Toronto leadership, senior Montreal lieutenants. I want you to come." Ingrid set down her fork. "As your wife or as your analyst?" "There's no difference anymore." She thought about this. "How many people will be there? 18, maybe 20? Will Bauer be there?" Lachlan met her eyes. "Yes." "Then I'll come." She started packing the next morning. She was methodical about it, the same way she was methodical about everything. Clothing for 4 days, her notebook, her reading glasses, a backup drive with encrypted copies of every document she'd assembled over the past several months, and her grandmother's cast-iron skillet wrapped in a dish towel and placed in the bottom of her bag, because she had lived in this world long enough now to understand that practicality sometimes looked strange from the outside and didn't care. She had no particular plan when she packed it. She only knew, in the part of her mind that tracked patterns and inconsistencies and things that didn't quite add up, that the mountain was going to be cold, that the people gathering there were not all traveling in the same direction, and that in her experience, when the numbers stopped making sense, something was always about to break. She was not wrong. The estate in the Laurentians looked peaceful from the outside. It always does. And the moment the convoy pulled through the iron gates and Ingrid stepped out into the frozen air, she saw it. A glance between two men that ended the instant they noticed her noticing. Nobody else caught it. Nobody else was looking. But Ingrid Solberg had spent her entire career reading what people were trying not to show, and what she saw in that half-second exchange made her blood go very, very still. Something was already in motion, and the man it was aimed at had no idea. The convoy pulled through the iron gates of Belmore Estate at 4:30 in the afternoon, and the light was already dying. That was the thing about the Laurentians in late November. The dark didn't ease in gradually the way it did in the city. It dropped. 1 minute, there were long shadows stretching across the snow-covered pines, and the next minute, the shadows had swallowed everything, and the only light came from the estate's exterior lamps casting orange pools across the gravel. The mountains didn't care about the people at the bottom of them. That was something Ingrid had understood the moment the vehicle crested the last ridge and she'd seen the estate below. A cluster of stone and timber that looked permanent and isolated in equal measure. She stepped out of the vehicle and felt the cold hit her face like a flat hand. Around her, men climbed out of the other vehicles. Lieutenants, advisors, 2 men she didn't recognize whose names she hadn't been given, and a driver who had spent the entire 3-hour journey watching her in the rearview mirror in a way that was not subtle. Lachlan emerged from the lead vehicle, said something brief to Prout, and moved toward the entrance without ceremony. That was when she saw it. 2 men standing at the edge of the estate's side entrance. Not the main doors, the side entrance, the one partially obscured by the angle of the building's east wing. One of them was compact, dark-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had been waiting for a specific thing to arrive. The other was broader, his coat collar turned up. They were not talking. They were watching the convoy unload. And when Ingrid stepped out of the vehicle, the compact man's eyes found her immediately. Not with interest, but with the cold efficiency of someone updating a count. His gaze moved to Lachlan, then back to Ingrid. Then the 2 men stepped back around the corner and were gone. The whole thing lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Ingrid stood there in the cold, her bag over one shoulder, and felt the specific sensation she'd learned to trust over 15 years of financial forensics. The sensation that arrives when a number that should be neutral suddenly isn't. When a pattern breaks in a direction, it has no innocent reason to break. She picked up her bag and walked into the estate. The interior of Belmore was the kind of wealth that didn't need to perform. Dark wood paneling, stone floors, mounted antlers that were genuinely old rather than decorative. A fireplace large enough to stand inside dominated the main hall. The staff moved quietly and quickly, which meant they'd done this before and knew better than to linger. Ingrid was shown to a room on the second-floor east corridor. She noted that Lachlan's room was in the west corridor. She noted that Bauer's name was on a placard 2 doors down from her own. She noted the location of the stairwells, 1 main, 1 service, and the single corridor connecting the east and west wings, which passed directly beside a locked storage room whose keypad she could see from her doorway. She set her bag on the bed and did not unpack immediately. Instead, she walked the length of her corridor twice, slowly, under the pretense of finding the bathroom. She counted 12 steps between her door and the service staircase. She tested 2 floorboards and found one loose, approximately 8 feet from her door, which would produce a sound anyone trained to listen for it would catch in a quiet house at night. She looked at the window latch in her room and found it new, replaced recently, the screws still bright, on a window set into a wall that was otherwise aged and weathered. Someone had wanted that window to open easily from the outside. She went back to her bag, unpacked her clothing, and placed her grandmother's skillet on the shelf beside the bed where most people would put a lamp. She was not most people. Dinner that first evening was set for 8 o'clock in the estate's main dining hall. 21 people at a table long enough that conversation fragmented naturally into clusters, which was either a hospitality oversight or deliberate design. Ingrid sat 3 seats from Lachlan and spent the entire meal listening to the clusters rather than participating in them. Bauer was directly across the table, 6 seats down. He looked different here than he did in Montreal. In the city, his confidence was the loose, expansive kind, a man certain of his terrain. Here, at this table, he was more contained. He laughed at the right moments and spoke at the right volumes, but something in his posture was compressed, like a spring holding tension it hadn't released yet. He kept his phone below the table. Twice, he glanced toward the east corridor. Not the main entrance, not the windows, specifically the east corridor, with the brief directional attention of someone checking on something he was expecting. Ingrid ate her food and said very little. The man to her left was a Toronto lieutenant named Carver, late 40s, with the road-worn look of someone who'd spent 20 years moving things from one place to another without asking what was in the crates. He'd been placed beside her, she suspected, because nobody knew what to do with her, and proximity to a Toronto man felt sufficiently neutral. "You're the accountant," Carver said. Not rudely, just the flat observation of a man who filtered people into categories. "Forensic accountant," she said. "What's the difference?" "A regular accountant tells you what the numbers say. I tell you what the numbers are hiding." He chewed for a moment. "That's supposed to be a threat?" "It's a job description." He grunted, which seemed to be his version of respect, and returned to his food. At the far end of the table, one of the men she hadn't been introduced to, the compact one, dark-haired, whom she'd clocked at the side entrance, was eating with a focus that suggested he wasn't actually tasting anything. He was sitting beside a senior Montreal man named Falk, who had been in Lachlan's circle for over a decade. They weren't speaking to each other. Two men placed side by side at a table of 21 who found nothing to say. That was unusual enough to note. She noted it. After dinner, the men moved to the estate's main sitting room for drinks and the first preliminary session, not formal business, but the kind of calibration conversation that happened before formal business, where alliances were confirmed and positions were indicated without being stated explicitly. Ingrid excused herself. She walked to the storage room at the end of the east corridor. She had spent 40 minutes that afternoon studying the keypad from a distance. It was a standard 4-digit model, the same brand used in 3 of the syndicate's Montreal properties, which she knew because she had seen the equipment invoices in the household records. She had also observed, during her corridor walk, the particular pattern of finger grease on 4 of the 10-digit keys, 1, 4, 6, and 9, which narrowed the combination to a manageable set of possibilities. She stood in front of the keypad. The corridor was empty. From downstairs, she could hear the low aggregate sound of men talking. She tried 1946. Nothing. She tried 6491. Nothing. She tried 1964. The lock disengaged. She opened the door. The storage room was approximately 12 feet square. Metal shelving along 2 walls held cleaning supplies, linens, and maintenance equipment. In the far corner, under a canvas tarp that someone had placed with deliberate casualness, there was a locked weapons case, the kind with combination rollers rather than a key, the kind used for secure transport. She did not touch the tarp. She looked at what was around it instead. The floor near the case had a thin track of grit inconsistent with the clean concrete around it. The tarp had a slight crease along its left edge from being lifted and replaced. Someone had accessed the case recently, today, based on the freshness of the grit, and had been careful to make it look undisturbed. The care itself was information. She memorized the roller positions visible on the combination lock, noted the case's dimensions, calculated roughly what could fit inside it based on weight distribution evidenced by the floor contact points. Then she walked out, relocked the storage room, and went to bed at 10:15. She lay on top of the covers fully dressed. She did not sleep. The second day was worse. It started with a breakfast where Bauer arrived 20 minutes late and over-explained himself to no one in particular, which was the kind of behavior that appeared casual and was actually performance. A man who genuinely ran late didn't narrate it. A man managing a specific timeline did. The morning session covered Toronto supply chain restructuring, presented by Carver with the enthusiasm of a man reading a legal document. Ingrid sat against the wall with a notebook and wrote down figures when they were stated aloud. Nobody asked her to stop. Nobody quite acknowledged that she was doing it. Bauer watched her write from across the room with an expression that was carefully assembled into neutrality. Lachlan ran the session with his usual contained efficiency. He asked precise questions. He let people talk until they revealed more than they'd intended. He had, Ingrid had noticed, a method of stillness during conversation that operated like pressure. People filled his silence and then kept filling it past the point where they'd meant to stop. At one point, he asked Bauer directly about the Toronto property accounts. "Clean," Bauer said, "audited last quarter." "Who ran the audit?" "Marsden's firm, same as always." "I want the raw files." A pause that lasted approximately 1 second too long. "I'll have them pulled." "Today." "Sure." Bauer's voice was smooth. "Of course." After the session broke for lunch, Ingrid watched Bauer step into the corridor and take out his phone. He walked toward the east wing. She gave him 30 seconds and followed, stopping at the corridor junction where she could hear without being visible. His voice was low. She caught fragments. Faster than expected. "No, not yet. The window tonight or it's gone." Then nothing, the sound of his footsteps moving away. She walked back to the dining room and ate her lunch and said very little. The afternoon session ran long until almost 6. During it, Ingrid focused less on the content of what was being said and more on the room's secondary activity, the small behaviors that existed beneath and beside the stated conversation. The compact, dark-haired man, who had finally been introduced as Reyes, a logistics coordinator from the Toronto office, checked his watch 11 times in 90 minutes. Not his phone. His watch. A man checking a phone might be expecting a message. A man checking a watch is counting toward a specific moment. Falk, the senior Montreal man, kept his jacket on throughout the session, despite the room being warm. He shifted his weight to his right side when seated in a way that suggested something was pressing against his left. 2 of the serving staff had been replaced between morning and afternoon. The new ones moved differently from the morning staff, slightly more deliberate, more aware of the room's geography. Ingrid wrote none of this down. She kept it in her head the way she kept account structures in her head, organized, layered, retrievable. By the time the session ended and people dispersed toward their rooms to dress for dinner, she had assembled a picture that she could not yet prove, but could not dismiss. She went upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed, and looked at the skillet on the shelf. Then she went to find Lachlan. She knocked on the west corridor door. Prout answered, which meant Lachlan had security posted inside the corridor itself, which was usual for a retreat of this kind. "I need 5 minutes," she said. Prout looked at her without expression. "He's preparing for dinner. Tell him it's the kind of thing that doesn't wait for dinner." Prout closed the door. It opened again 30 seconds later, and he stood aside. Lachlan was at the room's writing desk, jacket off, a glass of water at his elbow. He looked up. His face was the face he wore when he was tired and not showing it, a very specific tension around the jaw that she'd learned to read over months of dinners and late evenings and fluorescent-lit financial maps spread between them. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Talk." "Something is timed for tonight," she said. "I don't have proof, I have pattern. Reyes has been counting down to a specific hour. Bauer had a phone call this afternoon. East Corridor, private. The phrase he used was, 'the window tonight or it's gone.' 2 of the serving staff are different from this morning, and they move like they know the room's exit points. And there's a weapons case in the locked storage room on the east corridor that was accessed today." Lachlan was very still. "The storage room's been locked since we arrived," he said. "The combination is 1964. The lock has a grease pattern on 4 keys. She paused. "I got in last night." He looked at her. "I didn't touch the case," she said. "I didn't want to alert whoever owns it that it had been found. But based on the floor contact and dimensions, it's carrying weight consistent with at least 4 long firearms." The silence in the room had a different quality now. The kind of silence that exists when a situation has just clarified itself past the point of comfortable ambiguity. "You're certain about Bauer," he said. "I'm certain about the pattern. Bauer is the center of the financial irregularities I've traced. Whether he's directing tonight or participating in it, I don't know. But he's not going to hand you those Toronto files because there's nothing in those files he wants you to see." Lachlan stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment. "I have 8 men in this estate," he said. "Prout and 7 others. And at least 4 people in this building who are not what they arrived as," she said. "Possibly more. I need to make calls. I'd recommend you don't use any line running through the estate's main system." She reached into her jacket pocket and set a small prepaid phone on the desk. "I bought this in Montreal before we left. It's not connected to anything." He turned around and looked at the phone. Then he looked at her. "You came here expecting this," he said. "I came here prepared for it." She stood up. "There's a difference." "How long have you known?" "I've been watching a possibility become a probability since we arrived. The phone call today moved it to certainty." She picked up her jacket from the chair. "I need to go back to my room before anyone notices I've been in this corridor." "Ingrid." She stopped at the door. "If you're right about tonight," he said, "I want you in my corridor, room adjacent to Prout. I'll be more useful in my own room. I'm not asking for tactical reasons." She looked at him for a moment. His expression was the closest thing to open she'd seen on his face in all the months she'd known him. Not soft, but unguarded. The way a man looks when he's stopped calculating and is simply saying the thing. "I know," she said, "but I need to be where I can see the east corridor, and I need what's in that storage room to stay where it is until I know exactly when they're going to move." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. "Don't do anything without telling me first." She didn't answer that directly, which was its own kind of answer, and walked out into the corridor and back toward the east wing with her hand steady and her heart running at approximately twice its resting rate, which she acknowledged internally, and then set aside because there was nothing useful she could do with it. Dinner that night was quieter than the first. The food was good. The wine was poured generously, which was either hospitality or strategy, and Ingrid touched her glass once and left it. Bauer made 3 separate jokes over the course of the meal, all of them landing with the slightly too loud success of jokes made by a man who needs the room to be relaxed. Falk ate methodically. Reyes ate almost nothing. At 9:47, Reyes excused himself from the table. He didn't come back. Ingrid waited 4 minutes, then excused herself on the basis of a headache, which Carver accepted with the uncomplicated sympathy of a man who didn't track women's movements as a security concern. She went upstairs. At the top of the staircase, she stopped. The east corridor was dark. It shouldn't have been. The wall sconces ran on a timer she'd observed kept them lit until 11. She counted the bulbs she could see from the staircase landing. 2 were dead. Not flickering. Dead. Both in the stretch of corridor between her room and the storage room. Someone had killed them. Not a fuse, not a fault. 2 specific bulbs in a specific section of corridor, dead, on the night that Bauer had told someone on a phone that the window was tonight. Ingrid stood at the top of the stairs in the dark and understood that the timeline had just accelerated past the point where she could go back to Lachlan without losing the only advantage she had left, which was that nobody in this building believed the boss's wife was anything other than an inconvenience with a headache. She walked forward into the dark corridor. Her hand found the storage room keypad by touch. 1964. The lock opened. She reached under the tarp in the dark, found the weapons case, and this time she did not leave it undisturbed. She pressed her fingers along the combination rollers, feeling the position she'd memorized, making the 2 adjustments that the wear pattern on the rollers suggested were most likely. And on the second try, the case opened with a soft metallic release that sounded enormous in the dark hallway. She reached inside. What she found there, the specific count, the specific configuration of what had been placed in that case for tonight, made her breath go short for exactly 1 second before she controlled it again. Because now she knew precisely what was coming. And she understood, in the cold dark of a storage room in the Laurentian Mountains, that the next few hours would determine whether Lachlan Voss walked out of this estate or was carried out of it, and that the only variable standing between those 2 outcomes was a forensic accountant from Montreal who had packed a cast-iron skillet because she trusted patterns more than luck. She reached into the case and made her decision. There was no going back from it. She took 1 weapon from the case, a compact semi-automatic, loaded, safety on. She'd fired this model before, not the exact model, but close enough. at a range outside the city where she'd spent 3 years of Sunday mornings rebuilding something in herself that a previous life had methodically dismantled. Her first husband had been the kind of man who confused control with love and spent 4 years making her feel too large, too serious, too much of everything wrong, and not enough of anything right. The range had started as therapy recommended by someone she no longer saw. It had become, over time, something else entirely. Muscle memory, precision. The understanding that a thing aimed carefully is a thing that does not miss. She checked the safety twice, tucked the weapon into the back of her waistband beneath her jacket. Then she placed her hands flat on the edge of the open case and breathed in the dark for 10 seconds because she was not a person who did this, had never been a person who did this. And the distance between who she was and what she was currently doing was large enough to be dizzying if she let it be. She didn't let it be. She closed the case, replaced the tarp with the same casual arrangement she'd found it in, locked the storage room, and stood in the dead section of corridor with the darkness sitting on her shoulders and the faint sound of voices rising from the main hall below. Then she heard the bolt. It was the service door at the end of the east corridor, the one she'd noted on arrival, the one set into the exterior wall and accessible from the narrow maintenance passage that ran along the building's north face. The bolt was old iron and made a sound like a knuckle cracking, brief and dense and specific. Someone was coming in from outside. Ingrid moved backward against the wall beside her room door, put her shoulder blades flat against the paneling, and became as still as she was capable of being, which was very still. She'd spent years in rooms full of people trying not to be noticed, had learned that stillness was partly physical and partly a decision you made about your own presence. You chose to take up less of the air, less of the light, less of the available attention. She chose it now. The service door opened without a sound after the bolt. The hinges were new, she noted, the same way the window latch in her room was new, recently maintained for silent operation. A figure came through. Then a second. Both moved with the compacted efficiency of people who had rehearsed the layout. The first carried something low at his side. The second paused inside the door and pulled it closed behind him with a deliberateness that was louder than he intended, and she heard him exhale sharply in response to the sound. A small, pressurized expulsion of breath that told her he was tense and slightly less controlled than he wanted to be. They moved toward the West Corridor junction, toward Lachlan's side of the building. She gave them 4 steps of lead and followed. What happened next did not feel the way she'd imagined things like this felt. There was no surge of something clarifying, no sharp-edged competence taking over the controls. There was only the specific weight of the skillet she did not have. She'd left it in her room, which was a decision she was already reconstructing in real time. And the weapon she did have, and the approximately 11 seconds she calculated before the first figure reached the West Corridor junction and the geometry of the building shifted against her. She moved fast and she moved quiet, and she came around the corner of the alcove beside the linen cupboard just as the first figure reached it. The skillet was not in her hand, but the corner of the alcove wall was, in a functional sense, everything a narrow space can be when a person of her size knows how to use it. She drove her elbow into the back of the first man's neck at the junction of skull and spine, not with the romantic force of a practiced fighter, but with the raw, specific leverage of a large woman who has committed entirely to a single point. And he went down faster than she expected, which told her he hadn't anticipated resistance at all, which meant their intelligence about the layout of resistance inside this building was wrong in at least one important way. The second man was faster. He turned and had his arm up before she could recover her balance, and the blow he landed caught her across the left shoulder with enough force to drive her into the wall. The paneling cracked at the impact point. She felt the pain as a hot, spreading wave, and then lost it somewhere in the compressed focus of the next 2 seconds, brought the weapon out, pointed it at his center mass, and said one word. Floor. He went down. She was breathing through her nose, hard, trying to keep the exhales silent because the hallway was not isolated, and she did not know yet how many variables remained unaccounted for. Her shoulder was wrong. Not broken, she thought, but wrong in a way that would matter in the next 20 minutes. She looked at the 2 men on the floor. Zip ties from her jacket pocket. She'd taken them from the storage room's maintenance shelf because her mind had presented the option, and she'd acted on it without fully deliberating. Bound their wrists through the decorative iron radiator bracket mounted to the corridor wall. She used the second man's belt through the bracket as additional anchor. Then she went to Lachlan's corridor. The door was open. Not ajar. Open. Standing fully open with the light from inside falling into the corridor in a wide rectangle that should not have been there at this hour. Ingrid came through the door with the weapon up. The room was empty. Not ransacked. Not struggled in. Empty in the deliberate way of a room whose occupant had left it under control, taken specific items. She could see the jacket missing from the chair, one of the two phones gone from the desk, and departed. The water glass was still there. His reading glasses were still there. He'd left fast, but not panicked. Prout was on the floor beside the bathroom door. She crossed to him in 4 steps, dropped to one knee, pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Pulse present, strong. She turned his head and found the contusion at his hairline. Hit from behind, hard enough to drop him, not hard enough to kill, which told her whoever had done it had specific instructions about who was and wasn't disposable tonight. Prout groaned. "Don't move," she said quietly. "Stay on the floor." "What?" "Stay on the floor. I'm going to find him." She stood up and her shoulder told her about it in a language that was colorful and specific, and she ignored it and went back into the corridor. The sound reached her before she understood what it was. A voice, male, low, and carrying the flattened cadence of someone trying to conduct an interrogation with less time than they wanted. It was coming from below, not the main hall, somewhere adjacent, the estate's secondary sitting room that connected through a short passage to the main hall's north wall. She went down the service stairs. She came out in the kitchen corridor, which was dark and smelled like the residue of dinner, garlic and meat fat, and the ghost of wood smoke. At the far end, past the kitchen proper, a strip of yellow light showed under a closed door. She moved to it. She put her ear to the door, and what she heard next did not rearrange the picture she had assembled. It demolished it entirely. The voice she heard first was Bowers. That was expected. The second voice was not. "He had 3 days," said the second voice. That was the arrangement. She knew this voice. She had heard it for 11 years across dinner tables and conference calls and the back of vehicles. And once, 3 years into her professional career, delivering a deposition in a government hearing room where she'd been present as a junior observer. She knew its exact register, the way it rose slightly at the ends of sentences in a tick that the man himself didn't seem aware of. The second voice belonged to Aldrich, Lachlan's lawyer, the man who had handled the marriage arrangement, the man who had sent her the household accounts, the man who had been in Lachlan's inner circle for longer than most of the lieutenants in this building had been alive. "The 3 days are gone," Bowers said. "He's figured out the accounts. His wife got into the files." "She's an accountant. She shouldn't have been given access to anything." "You told him to trust her judgment." Bowers' voice carried something complicated. Not anger exactly, more like the exhausted contempt of a man who has had to work around someone else's miscalculation for too long. "You told him she'd be useful. She's been mapping the whole structure, Aldrich. She found the shell companies. She found the Toronto transfers. She's probably found the offshore routing by now." A pause. "Where is she now?" Aldrich said. "Upstairs. She left dinner early." "And Lachlan?" "We have him in the secondary sitting room. 2 of ours. He's—" Bowers stopped. "He's not cooperating." "He doesn't need to cooperate. He needs to sign a transfer document, and then he needs to not be a problem anymore." The particular flatness with which Aldrich said this last part, the bureaucratic neutrality of it, the same tone he used to discuss property transfers and legal filings, landed somewhere in Ingrid's chest like a stone dropping into very cold water. She had mapped the financial conspiracy. She had identified Bauer as its center. She had spent weeks building a picture of the betrayal inside Lachlan's organization and had believed, with the confidence of someone whose professional record did not include being wrong about money, that she understood its architecture. She had not understood it at all. Bauer was not the architect. Bauer was the contractor. The man who had designed the structure, who had routed the money, who had arranged the marriage that brought Ingrid into this house and then fed her just enough access to be useful as a distraction while the real timeline ran parallel and unseen. That man had been sitting across the dinner table from her for 2 days, at the position she had mentally filed as ally, as institution, as the unremarkable background furniture of Lachlan's professional life. Aldrich had built this, and she had walked right through his structure without seeing the walls. She needed 30 seconds to process this, and she did not have 30 seconds. She took 3 deep breaths in the dark kitchen corridor and let the shock metabolize into something she could actually use. And then she thought with the specific cold clarity that had gotten her through every professional crisis she'd ever encountered. What do you know? What do you not know? And what do you do with the gap? What she knew, Lachlan was in the secondary sitting room with 2 of Bauer's men. Aldrich was the operational brain. The objective was a signature and then an elimination. The timeline was compressed. Bauer's anxiety and Aldrich's language both indicated they were running against a window that was closing. What she did not know, how many people were between her and Lachlan. Whether the 2 men she'd left zip-tied in the upstairs corridor had been discovered. Whether the transfer document existed yet in a form that required physical presence or could be remotely submitted. Whether anyone outside this estate was involved or monitoring. The gap between those 2 columns was significant. Under normal circumstances, she would have gathered more information before acting. These were not normal circumstances. She put her hand on the door handle. She opened the door fast and came through it with the weapon level, and her eyes moving across the room in the order that rooms must be cleared. Corners first, then the space behind the door, then center mass. And what she saw in those first 2 seconds was this. Lachlan seated in a heavy wood chair with his wrists bound with cord behind him, a cut above his right eyebrow that had bled down the side of his face and dried in a dark line, his expression not frightened but compressed to a density that was very close to dangerous. 1 man standing to his left with a sidearm, 1 man near the window, Bauer at the room's small table with documents in front of him, Aldrich standing behind Bauer, and as the door opened and Ingrid came through it, the expression on Aldrich's face went through several phases so rapidly that they were almost simultaneous. Recognition, calculation, and then something she had never seen on a human face in her professional life, which was the specific fear of a man who has just understood that the piece he thought he had accounted for has been standing directly behind him the entire time. "Gun down," she said. She was speaking to the man with the sidearm. Her weapon was pointed at him. Her voice came out flat and even, which surprised her because her shoulder was causing serious problems, and her heart rate was somewhere that she would have considered clinically alarming in any other context. The man did not put his gun down. He moved it toward Lachlan. "You want to think about the next decision very carefully," Ingrid said. "There's one of you," Bauer said. His voice had recovered faster than she'd expected. He was standing now, the document still on the table in front of him. "1 weapon. I have 3 men in this room." "2," she said. "The other 2 are zip-tied to a radiator bracket upstairs." A silence that had texture. "You're bluffing," Bauer said. "I'm a forensic accountant," she said. "Bluffing is for people who don't have the actual numbers." Lachlan's eyes had found her from the moment she came through the door and had not left her. His face was doing something complex. The cut above his eye made it harder to read, but she caught the signal beneath it. The precise attention of a man who was calculating the room's variables alongside her and waiting for a specific moment. "Ingrid," Aldrich said. The use of her name, so ordinary in his ordinary voice, cracked something open that she hadn't expected. "Don't," she said. "You need to understand what you're standing in the middle of. This isn't about Lachlan. This is about the next decade of what this organization becomes. He's been holding it back. The Toronto operation alone could triple its current—" "I read the Toronto files," she said. "I read all of it, including the accounts you ran through the Cayman structure in 2019 that you backdated to appear as a 2021 audit, including the consulting fees you paid yourself through Marsden's firm over 3 years." She kept the weapon on the man with the gun. "You've been stealing from him for 6 years, Aldrich. Not Bauer. You. Bauer's been your instrument. The Toronto operation is the exit strategy. You move the consolidated funds through the restructuring, declare a loss, and walk away clean." Aldrich said nothing. "I found it 2 weeks ago," she said. "I didn't tell Lachlan yet because I needed to understand the full architecture before I handed it over. I needed to know who else. She paused. Now I know. The room had a quality to its silence that was different from before. Even the man with his gun had gone slightly still, recalibrating something. Bauer looked at Aldrich. It was a brief look. The look of a man who has just watched the foundation of an arrangement shift under his feet and is trying to determine whether the man standing beside him is an asset or a liability in the next 60 seconds. Aldrich saw it. His composure, which had been remarkable, developed a hairline fracture. "This doesn't change the numbers in the room," Aldrich said, still even, still the lawyer's voice. "You have one weapon. You cannot cover 3 men with one weapon." "I'm not trying to cover 3 men," she said. "I'm covering the one pointing his gun at my husband." She looked directly at the man with the sidearm, held his eyes. "I'm a better shot than you think I am," she said quietly, "and I have nothing to lose in this room except him. Can you say the same thing?" The man's breathing changed. She heard it, a slight deepening, the involuntary response of a body updating its threat assessment. His eyes moved to Bauer and came back to her, and she watched him do the math that people do when they are not ideologically committed to an outcome and are suddenly looking at the personal cost of the next choice. He lowered the gun. Not all the way, but 4 inches, which was 4 inches she didn't have a second ago. And then the window behind the man near the wall came apart. Not an explosion, not a shot. The window came apart because something large and fast hit it from the outside, and the man who had been standing near it was not standing near it anymore. He was on the floor, and through the demolished frame came 2 of Prout's people, moving with the coordinated urgency of men who had been given a position and a timer and were operating precisely at the expiration of that timer. What followed was not cinematic. It was fast and ugly and specific. The man with the gun made a decision that was wrong, and the consequences arrived before he finished making it. Bauer moved toward the table, toward the documents, and Ingrid crossed the room in 3 steps, got between him and the table, and swept the documents onto the floor behind her because the documents were the objective. And she had not come this far to let the objective leave the room. Bauer grabbed her injured shoulder. The pain was extraordinary. She heard herself make a sound she would not have chosen to make, and her knees went soft for 1 second that felt much longer, and in that second Bauer got past her and reached for the papers on the floor, and what stopped him was not her weapon, which she could not bring to bear from that angle with that shoulder, but the chair that Lachlan Voss, whose wrists were no longer bound because he had been working at the cord since the moment she came through the door, brought across the back of Bauer's neck with the focused savagery of a man who has been sitting in a chair for 40 minutes thinking about exactly this. Bauer went down. Aldrich was against the far wall. Prout's 2 men had the room. Prout himself came through the door 30 seconds later, a fresh bandage over his hairline, looking like a man who was deeply unhappy about the events of the evening but prepared to be professional about it. The room was contained. Ingrid stood with the documents at her feet, her left arm hanging at an angle that did not feel voluntary, her breathing coming in through her nose in the specific disciplined rhythm she used when she was managing pain she couldn't do anything about yet. She looked down at the papers on the floor. The transfer document was there, unsigned. Beside it, a second document she hadn't seen from across the room, a prepared letter of resignation, Lachlan's signature block at the bottom, dated 2 days ago. They'd been planning this before the convoy left Montreal, before she'd packed her bag, before she'd had any of the information she had now. The realization of how long and how precisely this had been built around them settled into her slowly, the way a very large number settles into comprehension, not all at once, but in stages, each stage colder than the last. Lachlan crossed the room and stopped in front of her. He looked at her shoulder. He looked at her face. He did not say anything for a moment, and she appreciated this more than she could have articulated, because she was not in a state where she could absorb language gracefully. Then he said quietly, "How bad?" "Manageable," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked up at him. The cut above his eye had started seeping again. He didn't seem to notice. His hands were at his sides, not reaching for her, not performing the kind of concern that would require something from her she didn't have available right now, just present in the flat, uncomplicated way that was the closest thing to tenderness she'd observed in him. "It's bad enough," she said. Not bad enough to matter yet. He picked up the documents from the floor. He looked at the transfer document for one long moment, long enough that she understood he was reading it, understanding exactly what it had been designed to do. And then he folded it in half and held it. "You said you found Aldrich's lair 2 weeks ago," he said. "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." "Not yet. No." The silence between them was not the same silence as before. It had a question in it, not accusatory, but real. "If you had told me 2 weeks ago," he said slowly, "I would have moved on Aldrich before this retreat, before tonight." "Yes," she said. "So why didn't you?" She looked at him steadily. Her shoulder was making its argument loudly, and she was not winning the debate with it. "Because I needed to know if there was a fourth layer," she said. "Someone above Aldrich, someone who gave him the original instruction." She paused. "There's a numbered account in the Cayman structure that receives a percentage distribution that doesn't align with Aldrich's own extraction pattern. It goes somewhere else. I haven't traced it yet." Another pause. "I needed Aldrich alive and unchallenged long enough to use him to find it." Lachlan absorbed this. He looked at Aldrich, who was on his knees near the wall with Prout's hand on his shoulder and the expression of a man who has run the remaining options and found none of them acceptable. Then Lachlan looked back at her with something in his face that was not anger and was not relief, and was not gratitude but was something that required all three of those words to approximate and still didn't quite land correctly. "You were using tonight," he said. "I was trying to," she said. "The timeline accelerated faster than I projected." "You could have told me. You would have stopped it." "Yes," he said. "I would have." She held his gaze. Her arm was genuinely not working correctly now. Somewhere in the building, one of the serving staff, who was not actually a serving staff member, was being located by Prout's people. And outside the estate, the mountains sat in the dark with the complete indifference of very large things that have witnessed many small catastrophes and remembered none of them. "There's someone above Aldrich," she said. "I need him conscious, and I need his phone, and I need an hour." Lachlan looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Prout. "Get her something for the shoulder," he said. "And then nobody touches Aldrich until she's ready." Ingrid looked at the man on his knees against the wall, a man she had trusted with financial access, with document routing, with the details of her own marriage, and felt something move through her that was not quite hatred and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both, in the particular district where you put the feelings that don't have clean names because they're compounded from too many other feelings that arrive too close together. She had been inside his architecture without knowing it. She had mapped his shell companies while sitting in a house he had helped arrange for her. She had sent reports through a system he had designed. The question was, who had designed him? And the answer to that question was somewhere in a phone that was currently in the pocket of a man who now understood that the woman he'd filed under manageable had just survived his best constructed night and was standing in his wreckage asking for one more hour. She reached down and picked up the second document, the forged resignation, Lachlan's name at the bottom, dated and ready, and folded it with her working hand and put it in her jacket pocket. Evidence. She was still, after everything, an accountant. She collected evidence. The hour she asked for took 40 minutes. Prout brought a first aid kit and a bottle of something that wasn't labeled, and one of his men, a compact, quiet person named Delisle, who moved like someone trained in field medicine and didn't volunteer that information, reset her shoulder with the specific, brutal efficiency of a procedure that has no gentle version. She bit down on a folded dish towel and made a sound that she would not have made in front of anyone she needed to impress, and Delisle pretended not to hear it, and that was the correct professional response, and she appreciated it. Afterward, she sat with her back against the sitting room wall and her arm in a makeshift sling fashioned from a linen table runner and her notebook open on her knee, and she thought, not about the pain, which was considerable and ongoing, but about the Cayman account and the distribution pattern and the things she had not yet been able to name. Lachlan sat nearby, not hovering. Present in the way he was present, occupying space without filling it with himself, which was a quality she had noticed early and filed under useful and had since reclassified several times into categories that were less professionally convenient. Aldrich was in the corner. Prout had secured him to a chair with the same zip ties Ingrid had used upstairs, which struck her as having a neatness to it. His phone was on the table in front of her. His jacket was off. His composure had not returned, and she did not think it was going to. Bauer was similarly secured in a different corner. He had a bruise developing across the back of his neck that was going to be genuinely spectacular by morning. He was watching the room with the tight, recalculating attention of a man who has not yet abandoned the idea that the situation is recoverable, which meant he hadn't fully understood it yet. The two men from upstairs had been located, still zip-tied, approximately 40 minutes after they should have been found, which indicated a breakdown in communication among Bauer's people that was itself information. Ingrid looked at Aldrich's phone. She needed the passcode, and she needed what was behind it, and she needed the link between the Cayman distribution account and whoever sat at the end of that wire. She had the phone. Getting the passcode from Aldrich via conventional persuasion was Lachlan's domain, and she was not going to be in the room for that part. Not because she was squeamish, but because she understood the economy of rooms, and her presence in that particular room would complicate dynamics in ways that weren't productive. But there was another way. She looked at the phone's lock screen for 2 full minutes without touching it. The screen had a subtle wear pattern across its surface. Not random, because no pattern of use is random, and this man had been unlocking this phone with the same thumb gesture for long enough that the oils of repeated contact had created a trace visible in the right light at the right angle. She tilted the phone toward the lamp on the table. A partial arc. Upper left quadrant to center. She tried 6-digit numeric with the arc as a constraint. 3 attempts. Then she stopped, because 3 failed attempts on most devices triggered additional security protocols, and she did not want the phone locked. She looked at Aldrich. "Your lock pattern," she said. "You're going to give it to me." He looked back at her. His face had settled into something that was working very hard to be dignified. "I'm not giving you anything." "You already gave me everything 6 weeks ago," she said. "You sent me the household records because Lachlan asked you to, and you didn't think it would matter. You were wrong about that." She put the phone down on the table between them. The Cayman account receives 12.3% of the net extraction from the Toronto transfers. Not a round number, not a fee structure. A specific percentage that implies a specific prior agreement. Someone told you 12.3%. Nobody invents 12.3%. She held his gaze. "You're the architect of the financial structure. You designed the shell companies. You chose Bauer. But 12.3% means you're the contractor, Aldrich, not the owner. Someone commissioned you. And that person is going to hear about tonight regardless of what you do in the next 5 minutes. And when they do, the question of whether you are still useful to them or have become a liability is going to be answered very quickly." Something moved across his face. Not a break. A flexion. A small structural shift in the dignity he was maintaining. "Give me the code," she said. "Or sit here while I explain to Lachlan who commissioned you. Because I don't need the code to make that case. The code just makes it faster." A silence. "You don't know who it is," Aldrich said. "I have a hypothesis," she said. "I don't have confirmation." A pause. "But you know I've been right about everything else." The flexion again, deeper this time. He gave her the code. She was in the phone for 11 minutes. What she found there required her to reorganize her understanding of the past 6 months 3 times in those 11 minutes. Each reorganization more uncomfortable than the last, because the data she was looking at implied something that was not merely a betrayal within Lachlan's organization, but a commissioned operation with external architecture, someone who had studied the syndicate's financial structure long enough to identify its weakest internal junctions, had recruited Aldrich at the precise moment of his maximum leverage, and had built the entire scheme around a timeline that used the marriage, her marriage, the arrangement she'd been delivered into like a parcel, as the distraction while the real excavation happened in the accounts. She had been a component, not a victim, a component, specifically chosen because her professional skills would occupy Lachlan's trust without triggering the defensive responses that a politically connected outsider would have generated, and her social position as the dismissed, underestimated wife would ensure that nobody looked too closely at what she was actually doing with her time. Aldrich had recommended her to the Beaumont family. She found this in a message thread from 14 months ago, a brief exchange, encrypted but no longer because she had the phone in her hand and the passcode in her head. Aldrich to an unlabeled contact. The forensic background is the point. She'll be credible to him. She'll keep him occupied. And when it unravels, she carries the accountability. She was supposed to be the person they blamed, the failed wife, the odd choice, the outsider who had infiltrated the boss's inner circle and systematically looted his financial accounts from the quiet office beside the kitchen. That was the narrative Aldrich had constructed. She was the red thread. She was the story that explained everything, while the real money and the real people walked away clean. She sat with this for approximately 15 seconds. Then she kept reading. The unlabeled contact had a communication pattern. Message frequency, response times, the linguistic tics that people maintain even in encrypted channels because humans are pattern-generating creatures who cannot help themselves. She cross-referenced these against the message metadata and found a time zone signature. The response delays were consistent with someone operating in the Eastern time zone, but maintaining deliberate irregular hours to obscure the pattern. The phrasing used 3 idioms that were more consistent with legal or financial training than criminal background. The unlabeled contact knew the syndicate's internal structure at a depth that implied direct prior access. Not a rival organization, not a law enforcement operation. Someone who had been inside. Someone who had left. She pulled up Aldrich's contacts list and went through it not looking for the unlabeled number but looking for absences. Numbers that had been deleted recently enough that their absence was still readable in the app's cache data. Ghost entries that showed in the synchronization log as removed rather than never existing. 3 numbers deleted in the last 6 weeks. She ran the partial data against what she'd memorized from the syndicate's business records. Not the accounts Aldrich had sent her. The original records she'd sourced independently through the legitimate business registries. The second deleted number matched a billing contact from a law firm that had represented the syndicate in a Toronto property dispute 18 months ago, and then terminated the relationship after a settlement. The firm's senior partner had left the practice 4 months ago. His name was in the property records. Castellan. She knew the name. Everyone in Montreal's financial world who overlapped with its criminal architecture knew the name. Castellan had operated as the syndicate's external legal counsel for 7 years before what was described publicly as a philosophical disagreement and professionally as an acrimonious separation. What was not publicly described was the financial settlement that had accompanied the separation, a settlement she had seen referenced in one of the earliest documents she'd found in the household records, a single line item in a legal disbursement account dated 19 months ago. See settlement. Finalized. Castellan had not left. He had been bought out, and he had spent the subsequent 19 months building the instrument of his return. She closed the phone. She looked at Aldrich. "Castellan," she said. The word landed in the room like something thrown at a window, the moment before the glass decides what it's going to do. Aldrich's face answered her before his mouth did, and his mouth never did, which was the only confirmation she needed. She stood up. Her shoulder argued with her about this, and she noted the argument and adjourned it. She crossed the room to where Lachlan was standing near the door, and she said quietly 2 words. Castellan. Montreal. He was still for 1 full second. She watched him process it, not with the blank shock of someone receiving unexpected information, but with the specific grave attention of someone receiving information they had considered possible and had hoped was not true. She saw the moment it settled into him, watched the settlement happen behind his eyes, watched his jaw set in the way it set when he had made a decision, and the decision was not gentle. "You're certain," he said. The phone puts him at the end of the Cayman wire. The deleted contact matches his former firm's billing registry. The communication pattern is consistent with his background, and the timeline matches his departure from the legal representation. She paused. "Certain enough." Lachlan looked across the room at Aldrich. "How long?" he said. To Aldrich, not asking Ingrid. Aldrich said nothing. "How long has Castellan been building this?" Still nothing. Lachlan crossed the room in 8 steps and stood in front of Aldrich and said nothing for a moment, which was its own form of pressure. The silence he used in the meetings she'd observed, the pressure by stillness. Except this version of it was different from the boardroom version. This version had the cut above his eye and dried blood on the side of his face, and the specific quality of a man who has been tied to a chair in his own retreat and is now standing in front of the person who arranged it, and the stillness of it was a different kind of stillness entirely. 19 months, Aldrich said finally. His voice was quiet and even and carried the flatness of a man who has nothing left to protect. He came to me 19 months ago, after the settlement. He had the full account structure already mapped. He'd been building it before he left, while he was still your counsel, Lachlan. He was inside the accounts while he was representing you, and he built the extraction framework from the inside, and he took it with him when he went. The room was very quiet. He needed the Toronto operation as the consolidation vehicle, Aldrich continued. Bauer was already running it with a margin irregularity that Castellan had identified from the legal files. It was a small leverage point that became a large one. A pause. He needed someone Lachlan would trust with the finances. Someone who would be given access and would be watched for results rather than for what they were actually doing. He found her through the Beaumont connection. The marriage was his idea. Ingrid stood by the table and heard this, and felt the specific cold of it move through her. Not the cold of shock, but the cold of a pattern that was now fully visible. Every line of it, every junction, every deliberate architecture of it, and the particular fury of someone who has just discovered that what they believed was their own navigation has been road that someone else built for them. She kept her face even. This was not the moment for what she felt about it. "Where is he now?" Lachlan said. "Montreal. He's been waiting for the transfer confirmation. When it didn't come by midnight, he would have known something went wrong." Lachlan looked at the clock on the wall. 11:47, 13 minutes. What happened in those 13 minutes was not orderly. Lachlan was on the prepaid phone she'd given him, the one not connected to the estate systems. And the conversation he was having with people in Montreal was the compressed high-velocity kind that moved faster than she could fully track because it was conducted partly in shorthand she didn't have the cipher for. She caught specifics. A building on Rue Saint-Denis, a floor number, 3 names given in sequence, an instruction that was brief enough to be a single syllable. Prout was coordinating something with the 2 men who'd come through the window, both of whom had the unheard efficiency of people who'd come out of the evening's events better than most. Bauer hadn't said anything for 40 minutes. He was watching Lachlan with the expression of a man recalibrating his remaining options and finding the inventory depressingly thin. At 11:53, Lachlan's phone rang. He listened for 12 seconds, said nothing, ended the call. He looked at Ingrid. "Castellan's not at the Saint-Denis building," he said. "He cleared it 2 hours ago." 2 hours ago was before the window breach, before the sitting room, before any of tonight's events had produced a result that would have been visible to an outside monitor. "He had a secondary trigger," she said. "Yes." "Something inside the estate." "Yes." She thought about this rapidly. A secondary trigger meant a signal, not a result signal, which would have come from the transfer confirmation, but a process signal. Something that indicated the operation was in motion, regardless of outcome, something automatic that didn't require a human intermediary to activate. "The serving staff," she said, "the ones who were replaced this afternoon." Lachlan looked at Prout. Prout already had his phone to his ear. The answer came back in 90 seconds. One of the replacement staff, a man who had worked the dinner service and left the estate at 10:30 citing a shift end, had driven a vehicle registered to a catering company that did not actually operate any catering services. Prout's people had located the vehicle 11 kilometers down the mountain road, abandoned, engine cold. Castellan had received his signal 2 hours ago and moved. "He has a head start," Lachlan said. "He has a plan," she said. "He's been building this for 19 months. He has a plan for if it works, and he has a plan for if it doesn't." She paused. "The question is which plan is faster?" Lachlan looked at her for a moment. That was not long, but felt like it covered significant territory. "You mapped his financial architecture," he said. "Can you map his exit?" "If his exit follows his financial logic," she said. "Yes." "Does it?" "People don't change their architecture," she said. "They rebuild the same structures in new locations because the structure is how they think, not what they think. The Cayman account has 3 distribution layers. That's a specific preference, not 2, not 4. 3. He built the Toronto extraction the same way. 3 intermediate vehicles before consolidation." She picked up Aldrich's phone again. He'll have 3 fallback positions, 3 exit routes, and he'll take the third one because the first 2 are the ones anyone looking for him would also think of. She was already moving through the phone's data as she spoke, not looking for Castellan's location, but looking for the shape of his thinking, the recurring preferences that manifested in account structures and communication patterns, and the precise way a person with 19 months of planning time allocates their contingency resources. She found it in a property record that Aldrich had photographed and stored in his encrypted files, a document from a land registry in the Eastern Townships, a property transfer from 14 months ago, the buyer a numbered company whose registration agent was a small firm in Sherbrooke that had also registered 2 of Castellan's shell companies in 2021, a property east of Montreal, rural, accessible by 2 routes, one of which crossed a bridge that would be closed seasonally by now. 1 route in, 1 route out. The third fallback. She turned the phone screen toward Lachlan. He looked at the property record. He looked at her. "How long to get there?" he said. 90 minutes. Maybe less with the roads at this hour. "He has 2 hours on us." "He has 2 hours and he thinks he's already won," she said. "He's running a victory protocol, not an escape protocol. There's a difference in how fast you move." Lachlan held her gaze for a moment. "You need a hospital for that shoulder," he said. "I need 90 minutes in a vehicle," she said. He was quiet. "He used me," she said. The words came out with less control than she intended. Not loud, not broken, but with an edge on them that she would not have permitted in a room where she felt less certain of her footing. "He built this around me. He made me the explanation. He sat across the table from me at my own wedding and handed me records and let me think I was finding things when I was standing in the middle of what he built." She stopped. "I'm not staying at the estate." Lachlan held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned to Prout. "Get the vehicles ready." They left Belmore Estate at 12:17 in the morning with 2 vehicles and 6 people, which was not a large force but was a precise one, and precision was what the next 90 minutes required. Ingrid sat in the front passenger seat with Aldrich's phone and her notebook, and a cold pack Delisle had given her pressed against her shoulder. She was working through the property records and the satellite imagery she'd pulled through the phone's data connection, mapping the terrain around the Eastern Township's location with the methodical attention of someone who cannot afford to mistake what they're looking for. The road was dark and empty, and the snow on the shoulders caught the headlights and threw it back blue-white. Lachlan drove. He drove the way he occupied rooms, without unnecessary motion, without performance, the wheel handled with the calibrated assurance of someone who had been moving through dangerous terrain since before she was an adult. She was aware of him in her peripheral vision and did not look at him directly because what she currently felt about the evening's accumulated revelations was not something she could hold and operate simultaneously, and she was choosing operation. "The third document," he said, after they had been driving for 20 minutes without speaking. "What about it?" "The one in Aldrich's files. Property record. How did you know to look for a third fallback?" She considered how to answer this. "Because the first 2 are always decoys. In financial fraud, the exit structure almost always has a visible layer that draws investigation, a secondary layer that draws more sophisticated investigation, and a third layer that only becomes visible when you understand the person's architectural preferences well enough to predict where they'd put something they actually meant to use." She paused. "The first 2 are meant to be found. The third one is the one they actually go to." "You've seen this before." "Twice. In large-scale embezzlement cases. Different people, different industries, same 3-layer logic." She paused. "People who steal at that scale are not impulsive. They're structurally conservative. They put their real exit in the least dramatic location, the one that doesn't read as significant. A farmhouse in the Eastern Townships. A property registered to a numbered company connected to a small registration agent in a mid-sized city, unremarkable at every level of description." She looked at the road. "That's exactly where I would put it." They drove in silence for another mile. "He chose you deliberately," Lachlan said. His voice was even, which was the voice he used when what he was saying was not even. "Yes." "Does that change anything?" She thought about this honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. "It changes what I know about why I'm here," she said. "It doesn't change what I've done with the time." He nodded once, slightly, the minimal acknowledgement of someone who has accepted an answer that is not comfortable but is correct. The mountains began to flatten on either side of the road as they descended toward the townships, and the dark outside the vehicle was the absolute dark of rural Quebec in deep November. No ambient glow, no reference points, just the tunnel of their own headlights and the road disappearing into it. At 43 minutes into the drive, Ingrid looked up from the phone. "There's a light on," she said. He didn't ask what she meant. He understood she was reading satellite imagery, which told her the property's power status through the phone's data connection, which she had been accessing through a grid monitoring service she'd found in Aldrich's apps. Single structure. Ground floor, 2 windows facing south. "He's there," Lachlan said. "He's there." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "He's going to have the account access on a device at that location," she said. "If he moves the funds before we get there, he won't." "You don't know that. I know he's been waiting 19 months to watch this happen. He's not going to move the money remotely in the dark on a phone. He wants to see the transfer confirmed. He wants the moment." Lachlan's voice was quiet and flat. "Men who build things like this need the moment, the confirmation, the knowing." She thought about this, about Castellan, in a lit farmhouse in the townships, sitting with a device and a Cayman account and 19 months of planning, waiting for a signal that was never going to come. "How long before he decides to cut his losses and move the funds anyway?" she said. "That depends on how long he's willing to wait for news that confirms the silence," Lachlan said. "Silence can mean success, or silence can mean failure. He can't know which one yet." A pause. "Which means we have a window." "How wide?" "Narrow," he said. "But there." She looked at the time on the phone, 22 minutes out. She put the phone in her jacket pocket and pressed the cold pack harder against her shoulder and watched the road ahead and said nothing else because there was nothing useful left to say, and because what was coming in 22 minutes was going to require everything she had left. And she had already begun the quiet interior process of accounting for her available resources. What was functional, what was compromised, what could be pushed past its limit, and at what cost. With the same cold precision she brought to any set of numbers that mattered. She had been built for this. Not by Castellan's design, not by Lachlan's arrangement, not by a father's old debts or a political favor or the decisions of men who had moved her like a figure on a board they thought they controlled. By 15 years of sitting in rooms where she was underestimated and choosing every single time to be more than the room expected. The farmhouse light was visible now, a faint yellow point in the dark distance, and Lachlan killed their headlights without being asked, and the vehicle moved forward through the absolute black of the rural road on memory and instinct and the specific controlled commitment of 2 people who had arrived by very different routes at exactly the same destination. 22 minutes, 19 months versus 1 night. And the woman who was supposed to be the explanation was about to become the ending. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel track that the snow had softened into something closer to a suggestion than a road. Lachlan stopped both vehicles a quarter-mile out, in the shadow of a tree line that ran along the property's northern edge. And everyone got out in silence and stood in the cold for a moment, doing the specific calculus of people about to enter a situation with incomplete information and limited margin for error. Ingrid could see the 2 lit windows from where she stood. Ground floor, south face, exactly as the satellite data had shown. The light was steady, not the variable flicker of a screen in active use, but the fixed glow of a lamp, which meant either Castellan was reading or he was waiting in the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for a long time and has learned to do it without movement. Her shoulder had stopped producing individual messages and had graduated to a constant ambient broadcast that she had learned, over the past 2 hours, to receive without responding to. Delisle had rewrapped the sling before they left the vehicles and had given her a look that communicated a professional opinion he was too disciplined to state aloud. She didn't need it stated. She knew what the shoulder was doing. She knew what she was asking it to accept. She had done the math on that too. Lachlan came to stand beside her. He looked at the windows. He looked at the track. He looked at the tree line on the property's east side, which provided approach cover for approximately 60% of the distance to the house before opening into a cleared yard. "How many exits?" he said quietly. The property records show one main door, south face, a back door, north face, which would exit directly into the tree line behind the structure. Two ground floor windows on the east side, both small. She had memorized the building's footprint from the satellite image during the drive. The basement, if there is one, would have a ground-level access on the west side. The records don't confirm it, but the property age and construction type make it probable. He nodded. He deployed Prout and two men to the north face, one man to the west. He and Delisle would take the south approach. He looked at Ingrid with the specific expression she had come to understand meant he was about to say something she wasn't going to agree with. "I need you on the vehicles," he said. "No. Your arm is functional enough." She held his gaze. "He chose me as the instrument of this. He put my name on the exit narrative. He sat at my wedding table and shook my husband's hand and built a 19-month structure around my life." The cold air came out of her in a slow, visible breath. "I'm walking through that door." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark. She could see the cut above his eye, still faintly visible in the ambient light from the distant windows. The dried blood on the side of his face. The controlled exhaustion of a man who has been managing a crisis for 6 hours and has not allowed himself to feel any of it yet. "Behind me," he said finally. "Beside you," she said. He didn't argue. He moved. The approach across the yard took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of frozen grass underfoot that compressed softly rather than crunching. The snow cover thin enough to walk on but thick enough to dampen sound. And the cold was absolute in the way it gets in Quebec, in the deep weeks of November, the kind of cold that enters through the face and works inward and makes everything feel more precise and more fragile simultaneously. Ingrid moved on Lachlan's left, slightly back, the weapon in her right hand because her left arm was in the sling and the right hand was steady enough. She watched the windows. The light in them didn't change. He had not heard them coming. At the south door, Lachlan paused. He tested the handle. Unlocked, which was not carelessness but confidence. The door of a man who had arranged the surrounding terrain and did not believe anyone was going to find this place. He looked at Ingrid once. She nodded once. He opened the door. The interior of the farmhouse smelled like wood heat and old insulation, and the faint chemical ghost of a cleaning product applied too recently to have fully dissipated. The front room was empty, but furnished, chairs, a table, a lamp casting the light she'd seen from outside. On the table, a laptop, open, a glass of water, a legal pad covered in handwriting, a phone face down, and through the interior doorway, in what was functioning as a kitchen, a man standing at a counter with his back to them, pouring water from a kettle into a cup, with the unhurried ease of someone in a space they consider completely their own. Castellan was shorter than she'd expected. 60 or close to it, the kind of lean that comes from metabolism rather than discipline. Silver hair kept long enough to be deliberate. He was wearing a heavy sweater and dark trousers, and the posture of someone who has spent decades in rooms where the authority was his by default. He heard the door. He turned around. His face, in the 3 seconds before it assembled its response, showed her something she would not forget. Not fear, not anger, but the pure architectural shock of a man whose structure has just been entered through the door he was most certain nobody would use. The recognition came fast. The recalibration came faster. By the time his expression had settled, it had settled into something that was still attempting to be composed. He looked at her first, then at Lachlan, then at the weapon in her right hand. "Ingrid Solberg," he said, as though he were noting an appointment. "Voss," she said. "My name is Ingrid Voss." Something shifted in his face at this. Very small, very specific. The shift of a man who built a narrative around a person and has just discovered that the person declined to stay inside it. Lachlan moved into the kitchen and Castellan took one step back and encountered the counter and stopped. His eyes moved to the doorway behind Lachlan, calculating the geometry. And Ingrid watched him run the numbers and arrive at the same answer she had already reached. There was a man on the north face, a man on the west side, and two people standing between him and the only available exit. The cup of tea was still in his hand. He set it down on the counter with a deliberateness that was the last available performance of composure. "You found the property through Aldrich's files," he said. stating it, not asking, still doing the reconstruction in real time. Through your own architectural preferences, Ingrid said. Aldrich's files confirmed it. He looked at her for a moment with something that was complicated by the specific frustration of a precise man confronting a mistake he cannot retroactively correct. The three-layer structure, he said. You use it consistently. Shell companies, account routing, and now exit planning. 3 layers every time. The third one is always where you put the thing you actually intend to use. She paused. I've been studying financial fraud architects for 15 years. You think the same way twice. That's the one thing you can't audit out of yourself. He was quiet. You built this around me, she said. The words came out without heat, which was not because she didn't feel the heat, but because she had made a decision about where the heat was and was not useful. You found me through the Beaumont connection, and you positioned me as the narrative, the suspicious outsider wife with financial access. When the accounts were discovered, I was supposed to be the explanation. You were a structural necessity, he said, not an apology, a clarification. I know, she said. That's what makes it precise, and that's what makes it wrong, and that's the last time I'm going to address it directly. He looked at her with the expression that people wear when they have recategorized someone too late. Lachlan had said nothing since they came through the door. He was standing to Castellan's left, close enough that the room's geometry allowed no movement in that direction, and the quality of his silence was the quality she had first identified in the meeting rooms of the syndicate. The pressure silence, the one that made people fill the space beyond where they'd intended to stop. Castellan filled it. The transfer structure is still intact, he said, to Lachlan, directly. The pivot of a man attempting to find the last available negotiating position. Aldrich and Bauer are contained, which means the exposure is limited. The external parties who facilitated the Cayman layer don't have names attached to anyone currently at this table. You close the Toronto accounts, restructure through the existing Montreal vehicles, and there's a version of this where the financial damage is recoverable and the organizational exposure is minimal. You're offering me a way to clean it up, Lachlan said. His voice was even and quiet. I'm offering you a practical resolution. After 19 months of building the instrument of my removal. Business, Castellan said, simply, without apparent irony. You sat in my offices for 7 years, Lachlan said. You structured every major acquisition. You knew the accounts at a level nobody else did because I trusted you at a level I didn't extend to anyone else. A pause. And you used that to build a framework to take everything I built, with my wife's name attached as the explanation. Another pause, longer. And now you're offering me practical resolution. Castellan said nothing this time. The settlement I paid you when you left, Lachlan said. Was that part of the plan? Did you take the settlement knowing you were going to build this? Silence. Answer me. Yes, Castellan said. The words sat in the kitchen for a moment. Ingrid watched Lachlan absorb it, watched the thing move through him that was not visible in his face or his posture, but was present in the very slight change in his breathing, a deepening, then a controlled return to even. The specific respiration of a person containing something very large in a very small space. The laptop, Ingrid said. Bring it here. Castellan looked at her. The account access is on that laptop, she said. You were going to move the funds when the transfer confirmation came through. It hasn't come through because the operation at Belmore failed, but the access is still live. She held out her right hand. Give me the laptop. He didn't move. It's going to happen either way, she said. The only variable is whether you walk out of this room on your feet or not. Lachlan said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence in the room said everything that needed to be said about the variable she had just described. Castellan walked to the front room, picked up the laptop, and brought it to her. She worked at the kitchen table for 31 minutes. Lachlan sat across from her. Castellan sat in the chair nearest the south wall, with Delisle positioned at the door. Nobody spoke. She was not simply reversing the transfers, which would have been straightforward but incomplete. She was following the money through all 3 layers of the Cayman structure, identifying every account that had received distribution, every shell entity involved in the routing, and documenting the chain with the completeness of someone who understood that financial crimes are prosecuted on documentation quality and that incomplete documentation creates gaps that expensive lawyers fill with reasonable doubt. She was closing every gap. Her right hand moved across the keyboard steadily. Her shoulder made its presence known at regular intervals. She ignored it at regular intervals. The lamp on the table cast yellow light across the legal pad where Castellan had been writing, and she noted in passing that his handwriting was precise and small and left-handed, which was the same observation she'd made about her own anonymous reports to Lachlan months ago, when this had all been different and she had been a different version of what she was now. She documented the original framework, the extraction timeline, the intermediate vehicles, and the full distribution record of the 12.3% that had been flowing to Castellan's personal structure since the Toronto operation began generating its inflated margins. 19 months of meticulous theft. She put it all in a single encrypted file and transferred it to the backup drive she had carried in her jacket since Montreal. Then she closed the Cayman accounts. Not transferred, closed. Permanently flagged in the network with a documentation trail that would make the accounts radioactive to any institution that encountered them for the foreseeable future. The money already distributed, a substantial figure though less than it would have been if the Toronto consolidation had completed, was a forensic accounting problem she would address in the coming weeks, through channels she already knew how to navigate. She closed the laptop. She looked at Castellan. The full financial record of this operation, the architecture, the participants, the transfer history, and the distribution to your personal accounts, is now documented and secured in multiple locations. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. If anything happens to Lachlan or to me, that documentation goes to people who will know exactly what to do with it. Castellan looked at the closed laptop, at the backup drive, at her. "You're going to let me walk out of here," he said. Slowly. The way people state something they don't entirely believe yet. "Lachlan is going to make that decision," she said. "I'm telling you the framework within which that decision exists." She looked at Lachlan. He had been watching her work for 31 minutes without speaking, and the quality of his attention during that time was something she had been peripherally aware of throughout. Not supervision, not impatience, but the specific attention of a man watching someone do something he did not know how to do himself, and understanding in real time the full weight of what that capacity was worth. He looked at Castellan for a long moment. "Get up," he said. Castellan stood. "You're going to give Delisle every device you have in this building, every drive, every phone, everything with a connection to what you built." Lachlan's voice was quiet and final. "And then you're going to get in your vehicle and drive, and wherever you go, you're going to understand that the documentation she just assembled is the reason you're able to drive at all." Castellan absorbed this. "There is no and if," Lachlan said. "That part of the conversation is finished." Castellan looked at Ingrid one more time. She thought she understood what he was looking for. Some sign of the person he'd designed her to be, the useful background figure, the structural necessity, the name on the exit narrative. Some confirmation that he had understood her correctly, even if the operation had failed. She gave him nothing. He gave his devices to Delisle and walked out the south door into the cold Quebec dark, and the sound of his footsteps on the frozen gravel was briefly audible, and then was not. And then there was only the sound of the wind in the tree line, and the faint tick of the farmhouse settling against the cold. Prout's people swept the building in 12 minutes and found nothing of additional significance. Delisle secured the devices. The legal pad on the table, Castellan's handwritten notes, which turned out to be a timeline of the Montreal restructuring he'd intended to implement after the transfer completed, was bagged and would add to the documentation. Ingrid sat at the kitchen table after everyone had moved to the outer rooms and gave herself the 60 seconds she had been withholding all night. Not for the shoulder, which was beyond 60 seconds solving anything. For the rest of it. The accumulated weight of the evening, the corridor in the dark, the sitting room, Aldrich's voice saying her name in its ordinary register, the moment she'd understood what the marriage had been designed to be. The 31 minutes of keyboard work that had been the most important professional task of her life, conducted in a farmhouse kitchen at 3 a.m, with a malfunctioning shoulder and a man who had tried to use her past 15 years against her sitting 6 feet away. She sat with all of it for 60 seconds. Then she stood up, picked up the backup drive, put it in her jacket pocket, and went to find Lachlan. He was standing outside the south door, in the yard, looking at nothing in particular. The sky had cleared while they were inside, and the stars over the townships were the kind that only exist at that distance from city light. Not decorative, not romantic, just present in their enormous, uncaring quantity. She stood beside him. For a while, neither of them said anything. The cold was still absolute, but she had stopped registering it as sensation and had reclassified it as weather. "The documentation," he said finally. "What you built tonight. The Cayman structure, the full transfer record, Aldrich's role, Castellan's architecture." "Yes." "What happens to it?" "It sits where I put it," she said, "as long as it needs to." "And if Castellan moves against us again?" "He won't." She considered this. "He built this because he believed the settlement you paid him was insufficient for 7 years of work. He believed he was owed something beyond what the contract specified. He's a man who operates on the premise that his assessment of his own value is the correct one." She paused. "Tonight demonstrated that his assessment was wrong. That's a specific kind of damage to a specific kind of person. He'll rebuild something, somewhere, but not this. Not against you." "You're certain?" "I'm certain he's not stupid enough to try the same structure twice against the person who dismantled it." A pause. "And I'm certain he knows what's in the file." Lachlan was quiet for a moment. "Bauer," he said. "Aldrich." "That's your domain," she said. "I'm not making that recommendation. I'm not asking for a recommendation. I'm telling you that what happens to them is going to be determined in the next 48 hours, and I want you to know that before we go back." She understood what he was telling her. She had married into a specific world and had operated inside it for months with the clarity of someone who understood what that world was without requiring it to be otherwise. She did not require it to be otherwise now. "I understand," she said. He turned to look at her then, in the direct way he had developed over the months of their quiet coexistence. Not the assessing look of their early conversations, but something that had come after. The look of a man who has stopped measuring distance and started seeing what was actually there. "You were supposed to be the explanation," he said. "Yes. For everything I'd done and lost. That's what he designed me for. And instead," he stopped, looked at the sky for a moment, looked back at her. "You're the reason any of it survives." She looked at him steadily. Her shoulder was doing its thing, the cold was doing its thing. 3 in the morning in the eastern townships was doing its very specific thing, which was to make everything feel simultaneously exhausted and exceptionally clear. "I didn't do it to save the syndicate," she said. "I know. I did it because I lived there, because I read those files and understood what they meant, and because it's what I'm capable of and it needed to be done." She paused. "And because he built something around my life without asking my permission, and I have a professional objection to structures I haven't audited." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Small, the kind of thing that in another person would have been a full expression, and in him constituted something significant. "We need to get you to a hospital," he said. "We need to get back to Belmore first," she said. "There are things in that sitting room that need to be managed before morning. Prout can handle Belmore. Prout didn't spend the last 6 hours building the evidentiary file. I need to walk him through the documentation sequence." "You can do that from a hospital." "Lachlan." "Ingrid." His voice was quiet. Final in the specific way that was not aggressive, but simply occupied the territory of a decision already made. "You reset your own shoulder in a Mountain Estate bathroom and drove 90 minutes and walked through a dark yard and conducted 30 minutes of forensic accounting at a kitchen table. The hospital is not negotiable." She looked at him. "Prout gets the first briefing by phone, on the way," she said. "Full documentation walkthrough when I'm out." "Agreed." "And I want the laptop." "You'll have the laptop." She nodded once. They went inside to collect what needed to be collected, and then they went back to the vehicles in the pre-dawn dark of the Laurent Ian countryside, and Ingrid got into the passenger seat and put the backup drive in the cup holder where she could see it, and pressed her head back against the headrest, and allowed herself, for the first time since she'd heard a bolt slide open in a dark corridor approximately 7 hours ago, to be still. They reached the hospital in Sherbrooke at 4:40 in the morning. The shoulder was fractured in one place, A small fracture, the kind that announces itself modestly on an X-ray and immodestly in daily life for the subsequent 6 weeks. The attending physician, a tired woman in her 40s, who had clearly developed a policy of not asking questions about patients who arrived at 5 in the morning with injuries inconsistent with the explanations offered for them, set the fracture, immobilized it properly, and gave Ingrid a look that communicated professional concern she was extending without expectation of reciprocation. Ingrid thanked her. Lachlan sat in a waiting room chair for 90 minutes and did not leave. She knew this because she could see the waiting room from the treatment area, and she looked once and then looked away because the looking was not productive. And she was trying to be productive about the Prout phone briefing, which she conducted in a lowered voice while the attending physician pretended not to hear. She was discharged at 6:15 with a proper immobilizer and prescription she would fill and then assess independently. Lachlan was in the same chair. He stood when she came out. He did not say anything immediately, which was the right decision, because what was available to be said right now was either too large for the moment or too small for what the moment had cost. And he understood that in the specific way he understood the value of silence, not as absence, but as form. They walked out of the hospital into the beginning of a gray Quebec morning, the sky, the particular flat white of early winter before the sun has committed to rising, and she could see the Laurentian ridgeline in the far distance, dark against the light, and somewhere up in that ridgeline was a stone estate where a night had happened that was going to take a long time to fully account for. She was an accountant. She would account for it. The drive back to Montreal took 2.5 hours. Ingrid slept for most of it. Not the deep sleep of relief, but the shallow, resource recovery sleep of a body that has spent everything it had and is running the minimum systems required to restore function. She was aware of the vehicle's motion and the sound of the highway, and once, when a truck passed at speed and the vehicle shifted slightly, she was aware of Lachlan's hand briefly on her arm, and then it was gone, and she went back under. She woke as they entered the city. Montreal in early morning had a quality she had not appreciated before living here, the specific dignity of a city that does not perform wakefulness, that moves into the morning with the unhurried confidence of something that has been here long enough not to need to announce itself. The stone buildings on the main streets held the gray light differently from glass. The river was dark and flat and wide. She watched it through the window. "Bauer's people at the estate," she said. "The ones who came through the service door." "Prout has them," Lachlan said. "The 2 staff replacements who left during the evening. One is located, one isn't yet. The one who isn't will contact Castellan when he can't reach anyone from last night. Castellan will tell him to disappear." "Yes." "That's acceptable," she said. "For now." He looked at her briefly. "For now." The Toronto accounts need a full forensic audit before any restructuring, not by Marsden's firm, someone with no prior relationship to the syndicate's legal or financial structure. "Do you know someone?" "I know several people." She looked at her hands in her lap, her right hand, functional, the left immobilized beside her. "I'll need 6 weeks for the shoulder. I can work from the office during that time if the files come to me." "The files will come to you." She nodded. They drove in silence for a few minutes. "The Beaumont family," she said. "The political arrangement. The favor that was owed." "Yes." "Castellan worked through them to find me, which means the Beaumont connection was a channel he had access to." A pause. "You should know who gave him that access." "I know," Lachlan said. "I'm going to find out. I can help with the financial side of that inquiry." "I know you can." She looked at him. He was watching the road, and his face in the morning light was the face she had learned over months of dinners and late evenings and one long night in the mountains. The closed architecture of it, and the places where the architecture was not closed at all, the jaw, the hands on the wheel, the specific quality of his attention when he was near her that was different from his attention when he was not. "The marriage," she said. "The arrangement." He said nothing, waiting. "It was designed to be temporary," she said. "A structural necessity, as Castellan put it. A component with a planned removal." She paused. "That was its origin." "I know what its origin was," he said. "I'm not asking you to account for the origin," she said. "I'm accounting for it myself. For my own records." A pause. "The origin is not the thing I'm addressing." He looked at her then, briefly, the sideways look of someone in a moving vehicle who cannot give the moment the full attention it would otherwise receive. "What are you addressing?" he said. She considered how to say it accurately. "I came into this house as a component in someone else's structure," she said. "I spent months not knowing that. What I did with those months was my own. The work I did, the things I found, the choices I made in a dark corridor, those were mine." She paused. "I'm not a component. I haven't been one for a long time, if I ever was. I want that understood." "It's understood," he said, quietly, without qualification. "Then we can discuss what comes next," she said. "All right." "I'm staying," she said, simply. The way she said things when she had finished the analysis and arrived at the conclusion and did not need the conclusion to be dramatic. "Not because of the arrangement and not because of the obligation, because I have unfinished work and because this is where I live and because the man I live with is worth staying for." The highway carried them forward. Lachlan was quiet for long enough that she wondered what he was doing with the silence, and then he said in the quietest voice he owned, the one that had no performance in it at all, "The strongest thing in my life has been the thing I didn't choose." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. It was already in the record. They reached the Outremont house at 8:40 in the morning. It looked the same as it always had. Stone, solid, the kind of house that had decided long ago what it was and didn't require external confirmation. The street was quiet. Someone's cat was sitting on a neighboring step, performing the profound indifference of cats at morning. Ingrid got out of the vehicle. She stood in front of the house for a moment. The air was cold and still smelled like winter coming, the way November air in Montreal always smelled. Not unpleasant, just honest, like something ending and something else deciding whether to begin. She went inside. The first thing she did was go to her office. She sat down at her desk with the backup drive and her notebook and the immobilized arm that was going to require significant patience over the next 6 weeks, and she opened a new document and began the formal accounting of the previous 18 hours. Not a personal record, but a professional one, precise and sourced and cross-referenced, the kind of documentation that would hold up under scrutiny in any form that might eventually require it. She worked for 40 minutes. Lachlan appeared in the doorway at some point with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the edge of her desk without interrupting and left again. She drank the coffee without looking up. At some point, the morning moved past 9, and the light through the window changed from flat white to something warmer, and the house made its settling sounds around her. The radiators, the floor, the sound of Lachlan moving in the rooms above. And she sat in her modest office beside the kitchen in a house she had entered as a stranger and occupied as a structural component and rebuilt as something she did not yet have a precise word for, and she worked. On the shelf where her equipment lived, the cast iron skillet sat with its permanent dent, the one that had arrived on the night that nothing had gone according to anyone's plan, including hers. It was not decorative. It was not a trophy. It was a piece of kitchen equipment that had performed beyond its design specifications and now carried the evidence of that performance in its iron, the way people carry what they've done through in the specific modifications it makes to their surface. She glanced at it once, then she turned back to her work. Outside, Montreal continued doing what Montreal did, with the unhurried permanence of a city that has seen many things and recorded none of them and endured all of them. And in a stone house in Outremont, the woman who was supposed to be the explanation sat at her desk and wrote the true account. Every figure, every name, every layer of a structure designed to erase her. And she wrote it completely, and she wrote it accurately, and she signed her own name at the bottom. Not the name she arrived with, the one she chose to keep. Ingrid Voss, forensic accountant, the boss's wife, the woman who read what the numbers were hiding, the woman nobody counted until she was the only one left standing in the room. The end.